Okay, folks, I think we'll get started again. Welcome back. We had a terrific opportunity to hear Jack Goldstone introduce the book Political Demography and take and handle well your wide-ranging and challenging questions in that first discussion period. As promised, we're going to move now to hear from two contributors to the book, and in Eric's case, one of the co-editors of the book, Eric Kaufman. We can tell you a little bit about him, although like all of these, I hope you picked up the sheet that gives you more detail. But Eric, as I mentioned, is a professor of politics at Birkbeck College and the University of London. Again, like Jack, a recidivist coming back to the center, and so we appreciate that willingness to keep coming back. Eric is someone who has written in-depth, book length as well as chapter length on these questions of religious identity and differential growth rates among those different groups and what that means in a variety of contexts. So we will hear from him, but we're going to actually start with Mark Haas, who is an associate professor of political science at Duquesne, as I mentioned. And as Jack introduced, we'll talk about some of the questions in terms of population dynamics, aging, and what it means for military and manpower questions. Author of a book, Clash of Ideologies, a focus on the Middle East, and a range of articles in the kind of premier expected peer review international security realm. And of course, most importantly, I've learned today, shares the same undergrad. In fact, we were there at the same time, a Duke University political science undergrad, which is the most important characteristic he brings to bear the table. So Mark, will turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming, and I want to thank Jack again and Eric and Monica, who's not here, for inviting me to be such a part of such a great volume. It's really nice to see it in print, and thanks to Jeff and the Wilson Center for bringing me down today. I really appreciate it. Well, I'm going to be talking about one of the items, one of the issues that Jack talked a little bit about, and that's a new challenge that the great powers are facing today. In the history of great power politics, they have not faced this one particular challenge, and that is significant aging within their populations. The reasons for this are what Jack laid out already. Due to steep declines in fertility rates, due to significant escalation in life expectancies, all of the current great powers of the world are aging, many of them at a very fast rate. And by the great powers, I'm talking about the usual suspects here: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, China, Japan, and the United States. And all of them are going through this phenomenon. Just a couple of stats here just to familiarize yourself. You see that according to the UN statistics that were referenced earlier, in 40 years or so, roughly at least 20% of the citizens in all the great powers I listed are going to be 65. China alone, which is aging at a pace never before seen in history, will have nearly 330 million people over 65. To give you some reference, that is more than the entire current populations of the UK, France, Germany, and Japan combined. So quite a substantial elderly population. And as aging progresses, on the other side of that, we'll have significant depopulation. In fact, we're already seeing that today. Russia is currently experiencing 500 to 700,000. There's 500 to 700,000 fewer Russians alive each year that we go through. They're losing that many per year. Vladimir Putin, when he was a president, said demography is the most important security issue, the most important security threat facing Russia and the world today, so taking it quite seriously. And what does this mean for international relations, international security, which is what I focus on? Has a lot of implications, but I'm going to focus on one today, and that is, what does this mean? What does global population aging or population aging in the great powers mean for American security interests? And it's to some degree, it's a double-edged sword. There are some important costs created for the U.S. The U.S. is aging, just like the other great powers. But I'm going to argue that actually population aging might be a benefit to U.S. interests, and that for the simple reason that aging is in the other great powers is likely to be a prominent support or a force for the continuation of American power dominance. And to the extent that that is a good thing, population aging is going to be a support for that. And the reason that is so is because due to aging these great powers, we're likely to see slowdowns in economic growth. At the same time, there's going to be massive pressures pushing governments to shift resources away from military expenditures to support for the elderly. You combine those two things, slowdown in economic growth and significant increase in social welfare spending, and the deck will be stacked in favor of the continuation of American primacy. The other powers in the world are unlikely, or at least the odds are going to be against, be able to mount a sufficient military challenge to the U.S. because of these other costs. And this analysis applies even and perhaps especially to China, which most people point to is the most likely peer competitor of the U.S. In the coming decades, which I'll get into for a little bit. Now, again, this doesn't mean the U.S. doesn't have problems. This doesn't mean that the U.S. isn't aging and various costs associated with this. But the U.S. is aging to a lesser extent and less quickly than the other states. And because power in international relations, at least in international security terms, is relative, if other states are hurting more than the U.S., that actually means that the U.S. is experiencing a relative gain. Right? If others hurt worse than the U.S. relative power increases. Okay, let's go into some of the details for this. All right? You know, political scientists, we rarely talk about new phenomena, I think, right? Just to this perennial patterns, or what at least international relations scholars are in. What happens over the long course of history? But aging is one of these things that is new. You know, never before have we seen a situation in which the world's most powerful states are aging to the extent that they are today. And aging, you know, as most of us know, and as what Jack hit on, aging is due to two phenomena: decreasing fertility rates and increasing life expectancy. Here you see some fertility rates for the last 5 years, of 2005 to 2010. Magic number is 2.1, of course, assuming zero net migration. If fertility rates are 2.1 or above 2.1, population growth 2.1, you know, population aging and eventually decline. You can see here all the great powers are below replacement levels, and most have been for several decades. The U.S. is the only country that comes close to meeting the magic number of 2.1. And you add these numbers, you compound these numbers decade after decade, and the inevitable result of below replacement levels of fertility is population aging. Here's just a snapshot from 1950, forecasted through 2050. You can see the percentage of people over 65 by country. Right? Japan will have well over a third of its population over 65-year-old. China, 25%. China is aging so fast it will overtake America in terms of median age within the next 10 years, aging very quickly. Okay, and these are inevitable. These numbers are very unlikely to be wrong. Okay, and the reason why is because people can count the 30-year-olds and the 40-year-olds today, right? And they can extrapolate and say, where are we going to be 2050? Now, the fertility rates may change for reasons we talked about in the previous session, but they would have to rebound significantly and go against long-term historical trends to counteract this, right? You either need a massive increase in immigration rates or significant rebound fertility rates to prevent this inevitable increase in the number of seniors in a society from resulting in an increase in the median age of that country. And meaning either a significant increase in immigration rates or significant rebound fertility rates is unlikely. So these numbers, they're predictions or forecasts, and of course, nothing is ever 100% with certain, but these are going to be much better, most likely, than Jack said, than economic forecasts because we can count. All right, what does this mean for costs? Population aging in the great powers is likely to result in significant costs for these societies. two big costs that I'd like to talk about. First, slowdown in economic growth. If we look at GDP, just break it into its most basic level, the number of workers times average productivity. All right, the product of those two things gives us GDP. Well, as populations age, more people are going to be entering retirement than entering the workforce, and the numbers are substantial. You look at those bottom four numbers there. These are this is the decrease in 15 to 65-year-olds, that age cohort. Over the next 40 years or so, Japan is going to lose roughly a third of its working age population. Russia, nearly 30%. Even China, right? That's perhaps the most surprising when you look at that. Over the next 40 years, China's working age population is going to decrease, forecasted to decrease by roughly a fifth. Right? So substantial. So what does this mean? Well, if GDP is the number of workers times productivity, and if the number of workers are shrinking by 20%, that means that that productivity needs to increase significantly just to maintain GDP levels. Now, productivity is likely to offset the loss of these numbers, but if nothing else, the fact that working age populations in many of the great powers are significantly shrinking means there's going to be a drag on GDP growth in these countries. I've seen some estimates by economists that by the 2020s, China will be losing 1% of GDP growth per year as its population ages. Right? We're already seeing this, in fact, in China. Jack alluded to this a little bit. China is the age cohort 15 to 35-year-olds, right? Kind of a sweet spot in many ways for driving China's economic growth. That is shrinking right now. That is happening today. And that is resulting in labor shortages. It's hurting Chinese economic growth. It's even more dire. The forecasts are even more dire when you're talking about Japan, Germany, Russia, where I've seen some estimates predicting within the next generation, at best 1% growth per year in terms of GDP, overall GDP growth of 1%. I know comparisons like this are dangerous, or many times apples and oranges, but just for context, if you look at the Soviet Union in the 1970s, it was averaging little over 2% of GDP growth from 75 to 85. And at that rate, 2%, it cannot maintain its position as a global power. Right? So 1% is going to be very hard. So the point to take away from this is that many of the great powers of today, many of the states that have been great powers for decades, generations, are probably not going to be, or might not be, great powers of the future. So real costs here. Compounding the problems of slowing economic growth, right? If GDP is the number of workers times average productivity, aging is going to reduce the number of workers, but societal aging might also affect productivity. So it might in a negative way. So aging might affect both components of that product. And why might productivity levels be affected? Because as societies age, they may be in the aggregate more risk averse. So maybe less entrepreneurship will be funded as people don't want to invest in risk-intensive enterprises. Or national savings rates could go down as seniors spend down their life savings, right? And as savings rates go down, perhaps interest rates go up, and you have some crowding out of investment. So the point here is, that major cost is going to be a slowing down of GDP growth. We'll probably still have positive growth, but the rate of growth is likely to slow down in the world's most powerful states. Compounding this problem, these costs for states are ones we're all familiar with. You see it in the newspapers, popular media all the time. Is that all governments in the industrialized world have committed themselves to paying for significant percentages or significant portions of the health and retirement of seniors, and these costs are going to be substantial. If you just look at some numbers for the Western countries here, if you look at the right-hand column, total public commitments to the elderly. This is not percentage of governmental revenue. This is percent of GDP. France, 30% of GDP dedicated to healthcare and retirement of seniors. Japan, 27. The U.S., somewhat at the lower end, but still 1/5 of GDP by 2040 will be dedicated to this. And so there's going to be a significant increase over the next 30 years. So governments are going to have to find hundreds of billions of dollars in order to meet their commitments to the elderly, right? So significant. Just to put it in terms of the military, right? If you look at Japan, roughly spends 1% of GDP on the military. Japan's going to have to find 15 extra militaries, right, over the coming years, right? It's sometimes my students think, well, they say, well, the military, there's much more spending on the military than social welfare programs. Well, of course, most of us know that that's not true, and these numbers indicate that, right? 15 times in the military in Japan, 4 or 5 times in France and Germany. Okay, what does this mean for the U.S.? Well, I think that the population aging and the world's other great powers, though it will have costs, which I'll talk about at the end of my talk today, is also likely to be a force for the continuation of American primacy. What do I mean by American primacy? The continuation of American power dominance in relationship to the other states. There will be no peer competitor of the U.S. It might not continue to be a unipolar world to the extent it is today, but the U.S. will still be number one in terms of power projection capabilities. What are these 3 reasons how social aging is likely to support U.S. Primacy? Well, the first, what I and others have called somewhat tongue-in-cheek, guns versus canes, right? Instead of guns versus butter, guns versus canes, meaning that because of the commitments the governments have made and are likely to expand, at least in some countries like China, to seniors, they're going to have to transfer money away from the military and dedicate it to health and welfare of their seniors. In fact, today, we are witnessing this dynamic where governments are clearly taking money away from the military and dedicating it to health and welfare of senior citizens. Japan, over the last decade, its security environment, most people I think would say, is not improved over the last decade. You have a rising China. You have North Korea, which has developed both its nuclear technology and its missile technology. So Japan's threat environment is by many indices diminishing, and yet Japan in that time period has cut almost every year its military spending. And the reason for this explicitly, according to Japanese leaders, is to pay for the costs of their burgeoning elderly population, right? They're quite clear about that. In fact, Japan has said the Japanese government said over the next 10 years, they're probably going to have to cut general expenditures rough 20 to 25% across the board in order to pay for their obligations to their seniors. We see similar cuts for military spending in France and Germany, Britain as well. Britain has announced that they're likely going to have to cut general expenditures by 10 to 20% over the beginning of the next decade or so. All right? And these are cuts for the military. This analysis of transferring money away from guns and towards canes applies even to China, which, of course, as I said, is the country that most people point to as the likely peer competitor of the U.S., perhaps even what's in the literature referred to as a power transition, where China sometime in this century will overtake America's power dominance and instead become the world's greatest power. Well, aging is going to work against that transition. China today has roughly 100 million people over 65. 15 years from now, China will have 200 million people over 65. 10 years after that, another will have 300 million people over 65. Right? By as I said at the beginning of my talk, by 2050, between 330 and 350 million people over 65. Right? Lots and lots of senior citizens. Now, China has some advantages when dealing with a rapidly aging population. China's current taxation rates are pretty low comparatively, so it has a lot of slack in the system. China's elderly probably have lower expectations in terms of governmental services that they can expect. And of course, China has an illiberal political system, which makes it somewhat immune from popular pressures for increased spending. But China has massive problems as well, right? This first is just the pace of aging. China is aging at a pace never before seen in human history. The rate of aging that took France and the U.S. 80 to 90 years to do, China is doing in 20. It's what Jack referenced. The one-child policy. The demographics. Instead of the sort of a gradual slope, right, fell off a cliff. Right, it was just a rapid change. China's elderly have very, very little savings, far little than what you see in numbers for the U.S. Or for Europe, and those numbers are pretty bad. Now, China has traditionally relied on the family unit to take care of the welfare of their elderly, but it's not clear that's going to be able to happen in the future. First, the numbers are staggering: 330 million seniors, and what demographers call the 4-2-1 phenomenon, where you have 4 grandparents, or one child responsible for 2 parents, responsible for 4 grandparents, right? It's becoming more and more difficult, more and more onerous or burdensome for one person to take care of it. As urbanization in China increases, as migration increases, as rates of divorce increase, the family structure to some degree is weakening. In fact, I read about last year where the Chinese government was thinking about passing a law requiring children to visit their parents in nursing homes. This doesn't seem like, if you have to have a law requiring this, or at least thinking about it, that doesn't seem to be a terribly healthy or a terribly reliable family structure. Now, it's still there, but there's something going on, that told me. And it also is unlikely that China will be able to, quote unquote, grow its way out of these dilemmas. Even if China experiences the rate of growth, the fantastic rates of growth it's experienced for the last 20 years, China forecasted out 20, 30 years will have an aging problem similar to what France and Japan do today, but with significantly lower GDP per capita levels. So, it's that phrase, I believe Jack referenced it, China will become old before it becomes rich in terms of GDP per capita. Perhaps, that we'll get an insight into Chinese foreign policies 30, 40 years from now by looking at Japan's foreign policies today, because there may be some correspondence there. Okay, so guns versus canes. Now, I'm not saying this is inevitable. Governments can still have choice. Governments can choose guns. But I believe there's going to be significant pressure for governments to choose canes. There's going to be political pressure. There's going to be moral pressure. There's going to be political pressure because seniors mobilize, at least in liberal countries they vote, but even in China, where they've tried to cut pension benefits, there's been mobilization, and actually the government has caved on a couple times, and actually instead of cutting pension benefits to the elderly, they've actually expanded them. So there's going to be political pressure, and there's going to be moral pressure too, in the sense that seniors should have some reasonable levels of health and welfare in their retirement years. Okay, so the deck, it's not inevitable, but there's going to be pressure. The deck is going to be stacked in favor of canes over guns. And to the extent that holds true, that helps American power dominance. Second reason why global population aging in the great powers is likely to be a force for the continuation of American power dominance is within military budgets, there is likely to be more and more purchases, more emphasis on spending for military personnel, not weapons or weapons research and development. So within defense budgets, which are going to be shrinking, a bigger percentage of that pie will be dedicated to personnel costs than to weapons development and weapons procurement. Okay? And why is this good for the U.S.? Because, or at least potentially good for the U.S., because if countries don't have the ability to wage highly technologically sophisticated warfare, they're not going to be able to challenge American power dominance, right? The U.S. spends $80 billion a year on research and development right now, which is much more than the military budgets of France and Britain, for example, right? Just on R&D, the U.S. tries to be at least one generation ahead in terms of lethality. If other countries aren't matching that, it's going to be hard to keep up. And we're already seeing this. We're already seeing governments within their military budgets spending more on personnel than weapons for the world's oldest country. Germany spends 4 times as much on personnel as weapons. France, Japan, Russia, roughly 3 times as much on personnel as weapons. The U.S., which is younger, it's almost 1-to-1. They spend a little bit more on personnel than they do on weapons. What's this have to do with aging? Why does aging stack the deck in favor of military spending on personnel? 2 reasons. First reason is as more people exit the workforce than enter it, labor costs are likely to go up. And that includes paying people to join the military, right? So if you want to attract the best people to join the military, you're going to have to pay them more to do so. And Europe, the European countries have admitted that. They say we want to attract people, we need to pay them more, and if we pay them more, that means that our personnel costs are going to go up. Okay? Second reason is that the pension costs for the militaries are themselves substantial, right? So, the former military personnel are not immune from aging, and pension costs, including in the U.S., are quite high. In fact, this is one area of weakness for the U.S., and just in terms of power projection, the U.S., I believe, just in terms of military pension costs, would have the 7th largest military in the world, just in terms of cost. So they're quite high relatively. But the U.S. isn't the only one. Russia spends more money consistently on pensions for its military retirees than it does for either research and development for weapons or for weapons procurement. Right? Why is this good for the U.S.? Well, it's simple, right? Every dollar and China has similar problems for the pension as well, high pension costs. Every dollar that's spent for military retirees is one less dollar that can be dedicated to weapons or weapons development or to active personnel. That means American power dominance is likely to be supported. And finally, reminded of Churchill's famous phrase about democracy, worst form of government except for every other. Well, when it comes to aging, in many ways, the U.S. is in the worst shape of any country, except for every other. It's bad, but it's better than everyone else. But I don't want to obscure how challenging the aging phenomena is likely to be for the U.S. And of course, we see this, in many of the current political debates in this country today. But according to the Social Security Administration, right, their own estimates, by 2030, the obligation. Well, let me back up. Right, according to the Social Security Administration, over the next 75 years, obligations to seniors are expected to outstrip anticipated revenues by $32 trillion. So a $32 trillion deficit. That's some serious money. If current trends continue, by 2030, Social Security and Medicare will absorb roughly 2/3 of all federal tax dollars. By 2050, all of federal tax dollars will be dedicated to Social Security and Medicare. Okay, clearly unsustainable, but if you project out, remember that number I gave you, 20%. The U.S. is obligated to 20% of GDP. Well, the federal government takes in basically 20%, right? So there you have it. Unsustainable, but it gives you an idea of where we are in terms of the magnitude of the problem, right? So it's huge, but the U.S. has some significant advantages when it comes to the other countries. First, the U.S. is the youngest country of all the G8 countries, and because it has the highest fertility rates, and then one of the highest immigration rates of these countries. It is, instead of a shrinking working age population, which as we saw, Japan and China and Russia are going to have, the U.S. working age population over the next 40 years is going to expand by almost a fifth. That's good news for economic development. The U.S. Has relatively low taxation rates compared to the other countries. And the U.S., American citizens have fairly realistic expectations. At least there's more slack. A number of polls that I've seen, when do Americans expect to retire? Much later than what Europeans expect to retire. Most Americans think they'll retire 67, 68, where Europeans are still in the low 60s. So, right, again, more slack in the system, because the longer people work, the more it lessens the impact of this problem. So the U.S. has some major advantages, but there's going to be, and the snapshot, or what I want to take, the main point I'm trying to make of all this, you add all this up, American power, there's global aging is likely to be a powerful support for the future of American power dominance. Now, if you like American power, that's good news, right? But there's bad news, too, that comes out of this in terms of American security interests. First, burden sharing. Everyone knows when you talk about international security and America's relations with allies, that's a familiar phrase, burden sharing, right? Meaning we have our allies pay more percentage of various common interests for the pursuit of common interests. That's going to become more and more difficult because the aging problems in some of our closest allies, Japan, Britain, Germany, France, are so acute, it's unlikely they're going to be able to share a greater percentage of the costs in pursuit of common interests. So in a way, American unilateralism is most likely to, I believe, is going to increase over the course of the coming decades. America will be asked, to the extent that it engages in the international system, it will be doing so more unilaterally. We actually saw this in the war on Libya, where many people are commenting on, very few NATO countries actually dedicate 2% of their GDPs to the military. It's happening today. The second piece of bad news, potential bad news, I guess it depends on your philosophy, is that even though the U.S. is the richest country in the history of the world, its aging problem is so acute that it too will experience crowding out. It too will experience the shift away from guns and towards canes. Right, we see this today, where Obama just announced $450 billion in cuts in the military over the next 10 years, another $450 billion in cuts coming from the super committee. Right, so cuts are happening, even in the richest country in the world, the U.S. Now, this isn't necessarily bad news, depending on your perspective. If if you support the grand strategy, what's called in literature a primacy, meaning $600 to $800 billion defense budgets annually, the very risk averse, the willingness to engage unilaterally, including in preventive wars and nation building, aging is going to hurt that the pursuit of that grand strategy. It's going to be harder and harder to do in coming decades what we did in the last decade. However, there's another grand strategy which people support. It's called offshore balancing in the literature, and that means basically less is more. That if the U.S. retreats from the world to a certain degree, if the U.S. cuts its defense spending and reduces its footprints in other countries, not only will it save the dollars dedicated to those projects, but it will decrease resentment and animosity directed at the U.S. So coming home will actually, less will be more. Less active pursuit of interest in the world will result in less hostility directed at it, which will make the U.S. more secure. Depends on which grand strategy you like. But either way, the odds are in favor of more pursuit of an offshore balancing strategy. That could be good, that could be bad, depending on your philosophy. So, the last, just want to, already did those two. Now, it's an aging world. It's inevitably an aging world among the great powers. There's significant costs for the U.S., but also significant opportunities. And the more that the U.S. takes advantage of its demographic advantage. It takes advantage of its enviable position in terms of demographics and doesn't fritter away, which I'm not convinced that it won't. The more American power dominance will be protected in coming years. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. Okay, I think Eric will turn directly.
Should I just continue it? Okay.
Sure, and then we'll have a period of discussion. Well, while you're pulling that up, I should explain part of why I'm pecking along here and would urge you to do the same, trying to share some of this with folks via Twitter. If you're following it and have it up, you can look at either the New Security Beat feed or Jeff DeBelco feed or Wilson Center feed to find some of what I and my colleagues are doing. I'd urge you to do the same and share some of the insights from our speakers today that way as well. So, Eric?
Thanks, Jeff. I just want to just reiterate, I guess, what Mark said about the Wilson Center and the ECSP program which Jeff runs, and what a great job they've done in sort of supporting political demography through years where it was perhaps less of a trendy topic. It's starting to build. I wouldn't call it trendy yet, but at least we're very glad to have the support. And I think as the decades roll on, that'll certainly be seen as visionary. So I'm going to sort of, the other thing I wanted to mention too was just to say that a lot of the funding for this book project came from the Weatherhead Center at Harvard University, and so I'd like to thank them as well for funding the project which led to this book. I'm just going to sort of take a look at a different branch of political demography. If you think of political demography, it covers a number of very discrete areas. One is population aging and the effects that that's going to have. We've heard from Mark on that. Another is the youth bulge, which is related, so it's about age structures, changing age structures and how they affect politics. But we can also talk about other branches of political demography, one of which is shifts in the ethnic and religious makeup of populations, which is what I'm going to speak about, or urbanization, or even pressures from population on resources. And those are also topics, particularly the latter one, which are covered in the book. Richard Matthew has a chapter on that. Also to say, there's a couple of points which I want to raise which are general, and that is, first of all, that demography is the most predictable of the social sciences. I mean, I've as a political scientist, I've been in policy forums where people were talking about, well, how can we predict when the so-called mukhabarat state, the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, like the Assad regime, when's it going to fall? And that simply involves a lot more guesswork, and is similarly with economic forecasts, as Jack mentioned. Simply a lot less predictable. Why? Well, because, I think as Mark mentioned, the 50-somethings of the 2050s are already alive. We know that the under 5 population in the U.S., for example, is a lot more Hispanic than the over 65 population. So we can project forward and say, well, we know that the U.S. population or the electorate as a whole will be a lot more Hispanic in 2050 than it is today. That degree of predictability is just quite rare in the social sciences, and that's why demography is such a useful policy tool, and it's such a useful tool when it comes to looking at different political futures. And there's still a lot of resistance, I'm sad to say, in political science to this. And I believe part of this is because political scientists don't want to believe that something as basic as demographic shifts can affect politics. They like to believe that political scientists or political science variables are the ones that control all of the others, which is not entirely correct. Okay. Now, I am based at Birkbeck College, University of London. I'm Canadian, so I don't have a British accent. I apologize. I will try and put on a Northern Irish accent a little later on, so hopefully that'll work. So just to talk a bit about this branch of political demography, which looks at the different growth rates of ethnic groups and religions within states. So Jack and Mark have talked about, for example, the fact that Ethiopia is going to overtake Russia in population around 2020. That sort of dynamic where you have certain countries growing and others shrinking, and so the relative ranking between countries changes. But you can also look at the relative position of ethnic groups within a country. So this is the national policy context. And this is where differential ethnic and religious population growth comes in. It's looking at the changing ethnic makeup and the changing religious makeup of countries and asking what effect does that have on politics, and perhaps does it lead to violence? Because we know that basically all wars that are taking place today are taking place within countries. So that is a connection between demography and the literature on civil wars. And in fact, most of those civil wars, roughly somewhere in the order of 70-80%, concern ethnic and religious rather than class or other factors. So what I'm going to cover here is, first of all, the question of the demographic transition. The reason why this topic is becoming more important today is because of the speed of the demographic transition. The demographic transition, as Jack mentioned, shift from high birth rates and high death rates, which produce a stable population, to low birth rates and low death rates, which also produce a stable population. But in between those two stable states, you get a lag effect where the death rates fall first and the birth rates lag behind, so you get population explosion. The size of the population explosion in the West between the late 18th century and 1900 or 1950, during that period you saw populations of countries like France, Britain, and so on, expand 3, maybe at the outside 4 or 5 times. Still a major change, but not on the scale of what we're seeing in much of the developing world. In much of the developing world, the demographic transition will produce increases of between 8 and 24 times in terms of the number of people in these countries. Why? Simply because the medical technology, the sanitation, and other technology, the state of technology is simply much better in the mid to late 20th century than it was in the 18th, 19th century when a lot of the Western countries were going through their transition. So it's a sharper population explosion that takes place. The other part of the story is that the difference between the developed world, the West plus East Asia, and particularly the West vis-a-vis the developing world is in terms of, so you have a youth bulge scenario in the developing world, you have aging populations in the developed. The dissonance between those two parts of the world is going to reach its maximum around 2050. So we're in the process of this demographic turbulence, which is why this is a more important topic now than it might have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So we're coming into a period of really quite unprecedented demographic disparity between different parts of the world. And that's kind of where the focus is here, on the disparities, the unevenness. So as you get that demographic transition and the intense transition, you get unevenness, which leads to different ethnic groups and religions to grow at different rates. And that's what changes the composition of populations. So it's that change in the ethnic and religious mix within a country which is going to be the focus then of this talk. So the key questions are, does demography automatically translate into ethnic and religious change? You might say, well, of course it does, but actually it's important that we bring in some social science as well. So the demography, which was originally adapted for biological populations, a biological population is not identical with a social group, because social groups can redefine their boundaries. An ethnic group can redefine its boundaries. There's assimilation which is possible between groups. That means that ethnic groups are not coterminous with biological populations, even though there is a considerable degree to which those demographic dynamics which affect the biology do translate into society and politics. A lot of sociologists and political scientists don't really want to face up to that. But it is the case, particularly in situations where ethnic group boundaries are very tight, where there's not a lot of assimilation that's possible, as in, for example, India between Hindus and Muslims, as in Northern Ireland between Protestants and Catholics, where there are strong taboos against intermarriage. There's very little change in ethnic boundaries. In those situations, demographic change is more likely to lead to significant political change or even violence. So we want to ask the question, first of all, does demography lead to ethnic and religious change? Secondly, when does ethnic and religious change lead to political change? And that's a second step. It's different from the first step. And Furthermore, when does it lead to violence, violent political change and civil war? At the last point, which I won't spend as much time on, is something known as demographic engineering, how states, governments, political actors attempt to engineer demography, change the facts on the ground to strengthen their political claims. Okay, we'll just start with some basic trends which many of you might be familiar with. One is the so-called Browning of America, which appears quite regularly as a discourse in the news. And this looks at the state of California and some projections which have been made of shifts in the racial composition of California's population between 1970 here and 2030. Now, we know already now, where are we, 2010, that the non-Hispanic white population is a minority of the total in California. And the predictions are that that will continue through to 2030. But there is an argument here which says, well, is it automatically the case that when we know the Hispanic population here, which is in brown, has high fertility, it has a young age structure, and it benefits from immigration. So those are all forces that would lead to an increase in the Hispanic population. But one of the reasons why we also have to maintain a focus on the social and political side of things is that it is possible that there's going to be a certain blending between, say, the Hispanic, the Asian, and the non-Hispanic white population through intermarriage or through even the redefinition of boundaries such that perhaps the offspring of, say, white and East Asian unions or white and Hispanic unions might be considered white or might consider themselves white. So because of this fuzziness at the boundaries, we can't quite read off from pure population dynamics into ethnic change. However, it is an important it's a useful working assumption that these sorts of demographic changes are more likely. So that's the first question, is the question of whether and when demographic change leads to ethnic change. The second question is perhaps outlined here, and you probably will see more and more of these kinds of headlines about the demographics of the two political parties here in the United States. The question in this case would be, to what we know that, or at least the projections say, that the U.S. will be a third Hispanic in 2050 or 2040. To what degree is the increase of Hispanic voters in the electorate going to make a difference to the strength of the two major parties? The assumption of many people is, well, look, 60 to 70% of Hispanics tend to support the Democrats, and therefore we can read off a political change which will be a shift in partisanship in the direction of the Democrats. But of course, we also know that in the U.S. political system, there's political marketing and floating voters are important phenomena. And we know that the Republican Party, too, has tried to court Hispanic voters. So we can't simply assume that just because even if there is a rise in the Hispanic population, even if they don't assimilate into the non-Hispanic white population, it's not automatically the case this will benefit the Democrats, even though that is what many people would assume. Now, talking about violence for a minute, this is the Ivory Coast. There's a chapter in the book by Ronhild Nordas on Ivory Coast. There's also a chapter on Uganda by Elliot Green, which looks at demographic dynamics. I think it's important to make the argument that population change in many cases does lead to political change and violence. Doesn't always. I tried to make the point. We tried to be open-minded here. It's possible that assimilation and ethnic group boundary redefinition can go against and mitigate demographic change. But it's also the case in other periods and other places that demographic change can lead to violence, can lead to civil war. In the case of Ivory Coast, it's a somewhat complex picture. You have a history of migration from northern countries like Burkina Faso, which lies just to the north of Ivory Coast, which tends to be, these countries tend to be overwhelmingly Muslim. The southern part of Ivory Coast is largely Christian. There has been, since colonial times, migration from the north to the south to work on the plantations, the coffee and chocolate, coffee plantations. So what this leads to, what this has led to, is a significant increase in the foreign-born and Muslim component of the population in Ivory Coast. Now, it was for a long time the case that this did not lead to violence. This had not been mobilized, and until the 1990s, when you had democratization. And all of a sudden, parties are organizing, they need voting bases, and they look to ethnic divisions. And that's another component of the story here, and that is democratization introduces the idea that numbers matter. So when you have a dictator like Saddam Hussein, it doesn't matter what the percentage of Sunnis and Shias is in the country. Once you have elections, the fact that Shias are a majority matters, because they then come into power if people are voting on ethnic lines. So the democratization that we are still witnessing today, the so-called third wave, post-1980s democratization in Latin America and Asia and Africa, is compounding the influence of demography in politics. So the Ivory Coast case, where civil war broke out in 2000 and there have been ructions in the elections, I think illustrates the possibility that demographic change can lead to political violence. I said I'd do a Northern Ireland accent. I will attempt it here. One of the, perhaps the most famous cases, or one of the paradigm cases, along with Israel, Palestine, for how demographic shifts feed into conflict is Northern Ireland. And this is, what happened in Northern Ireland is very interesting. In 1965, Protestants made up roughly 2/3 of the population of Northern Ireland. That's in 1965. By the time we get to 2005, 40 years later, the proportions are pretty close to equal. The Protestants might be 53 versus 47 Catholic. And that shift in demography actually plays an very important part in explaining what happened in Northern Ireland during the so-called Troubles between 1969, when the IRA campaign begins, and to the ceasefire in 1994. As Terence O'Neill explains it, and here I'll do my best, the basic fear of Protestants in Northern Ireland is that they will be outbred by the Roman Catholics. It is as simple as that. Okay, so what's he saying? He's basically saying that as Terence O'Neill, who represents the Protestants, who incidentally form the government of Northern Ireland every year because they're the majority, which obviously you can see is going to cause a problem. But because they're afraid that the Catholics are increasing, they're trying to encourage Catholics to leave Northern Ireland. Prior to 1965, Catholics had been leaving Northern Ireland at a significant enough rate that they didn't change the ethnic balance in the population. After 1965, they weren't leaving in large enough numbers, partly because of the welfare state which the British had introduced into Northern Ireland. So the Unionists were saying, if we can just make their life bloody intolerable, don't give them the vote, poor housing, whatever, they're going to leave and go to England or wherever. Didn't work out that way. In fact, what it did lead to was IRA mobilization after the civil rights movement, followed by Unionist repression, and then the cycle begins for civil war. Simply to make the argument that demography can very much play a role, certainly fears of demographic change compound the importance of understanding demography and its role in civil war. Similarly with the Israel-Palestine issue. Okay, where else can we see the influence of demography? Sometimes people are not attuned to where demography is playing a role. You may be aware of the success of Islamist parties in Egypt, in Morocco, and Tunisia, also in Turkey, and in other parts of the Middle East. Is there a demographic story to this? I believe there actually is a very important demographic backstory to this, which is the fact that in a lot of these majority Muslim countries, you have a relatively secular part of the population, and you have a more religious or religious fundamentalist part of the population. Typically, seculars are concentrated in the cities. I had a graduate student who's Egyptian, participated in Tahrir Square in the riots. The constituency that drove the Arab Spring in Egypt was a secular, well-educated urban constituency. The cities of the Muslim-majority Middle East, if you think of Istanbul, Algiers, Tehran, Cairo, so on, these cities have relatively secular cultures, or had during the period of Pan-Arabism, the period of Iranian and Turkish nationalism. However, the population expansion and growth was really in the religious part of the population in the countryside. And you had a tremendous migration to the cities of pious people coming from the countryside who really did not have, who weren't easily mobilizable into the dominant socialist or Arabist type narrative. not as easily anyway. Instead, they were a constituency for groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists. So this population growth in the countryside, this population explosion really, to some extent, overwhelms the secular culture of urban areas and helps drive Islamism. And actually, this is kind of in some way, a replay of what happened in the United States, oddly enough, to a lesser extent, but still you can see in the United States similar trends. So this is comes from an important article by Andrew Greeley, Melissa Wilde, and Michael Hout in 2001, where they asked this question: why is it the case that in the year 1900, or amongst white Protestant Americans born in 1900, the vast majority were mainline Protestants from liberal denominations, whereas by the time we get to white Protestant Americans born in 1975, only a third or slightly more than a third are members of the liberal denomination. So the conservative denominations within Protestantism seem to have grown substantially over this period in the 20th century. What explains that? Turns out 75% of it is explained by the fact that you had higher birth rates within the conservative Protestant community as opposed to the liberal. It's not about switching from Episcopalian to Southern Baptist. It's much more about the significant population growth in the sort of rural, more southern Bible Belt areas. And that's similar to what I think has occurred in the Muslim world. And that actually does shape politics. So in 1980, or in the late 70s, you get a mobilization of this group as the moral majority, as the religious right, where it had not been mobilized before. But that couldn't have taken place if they hadn't have grown substantially demographically already. And I'm just sort of giving you a taste of a number of different areas within this branch of political demography that looks at ethnic and religious change. This is quite an interesting one. I don't know how many of you were aware of the riots in Beit Shemesh in Jerusalem that took place on New Year's Day, or I think it was the 30th or the 31st. And what this reflects is an increasingly assertive and bolder expression of ultra-Orthodox and religious Jewish politics within Israel. And that in turn stems from the fact that the ultra-Orthodox are growing at a staggering rate as a percentage of the Jewish population of Israel, and of the diaspora, by the way, where it's predicted that a majority of Jews, not only, in the diaspora, will be ultra-Orthodox as we go beyond 2050. It's a major shift. Why? The ultra-Orthodox have 3 to 4 times the birth rate of mainstream Jews, secular Jews. They also retain there are very few people who are lost from that community. The combination then of membership retention and very high birth rates drives a very high population growth. So if you look at the Israeli school system in the Jewish sector, in 1960 only a few percentage of the children were ultra-Orthodox. That's now up to a third. That's taken place really in, a couple of generations. And so Jerusalem has elected its first ultra-Orthodox mayor. And now posters with women's faces are being defaced throughout in the Jerusalem area. Now these riots, which really are around issues such as sex segregation of buses. In this case, a schoolgirl was wearing the standard public school uniform of Israeli school children, but in a religious and ultra-Orthodox Jewish setting, that was enough to lead to her getting spat on and abused and so on. So you have increasingly the power of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. Now, this is driven by the population growth of the ultra-Orthodox, but one of the reasons I find this particularly interesting is when we talk about the religious right or the Muslim Brotherhood, the growth there came from poor, uneducated, rural populations who happen to be religious, coming into the cities, expanding in number. In the case of the ultra-Orthodox, we have what some demographers would call a second demographic transition phenomenon. In other words, because the ultra-Orthodox are religious, they're having more kids. Not because they're poor, not because they're rural. In fact, they're living in cities. They have access to all of modernity, contraception, education, you name it. They are deliberately rejecting that in contrast to the majority of the population. And so it's deliberate. It's a value choice. And what the second demographic transition argues is that increasingly as societies modernize, fertility becomes a matter of choice. It's not about you have to have kids because you need them to work the land. It's you can have kids if you want to, If you don't want to, you've got contraception right there. And so the values are playing a bigger role in driving fertility and population growth. And this is what's behind what's going on in Israel, which I find quite interesting. Okay, try and wind it up. Last two slides, this slide and the conclusion. Last slide I want to talk about is demographic engineering. That is where politicians deliberately try to change the ethnic and religious facts on the ground in order to strengthen political claims. So here we have a protest in Istanbul recently against the 2014 Sochi Olympic Games, which will be held by Russia. Now, Sochi is in the homeland of the Circassians, who were ethnically cleansed in a brutal occupation by the Tsarist Empire in the 19th century, and they were driven largely into the Ottoman Empire. What the Russians were trying to do at the time was to make sure that there was no fifth column there that could advance Ottoman Muslim interests in the region, in the Caucasus. They were also engaged later in the 20th century under Stalin with the Chechens. Other groups, the Volga Germans, the Tatars, were deported en masse to Siberia. This kind of deportation, sometimes you also see where governments send settlers from the majority group. So the Chinese sending Chinese settlers into Tibet, for example, the Indonesians sending Javanese settlers into Papua. Those are all policies which are meant to strengthen the hold of the regime demographically in an area. Another way in which demographic engineering can take place is through the redrawing of borders. So the Lieberman plan by Israeli Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, the right-wing foreign minister, his argument is, well, look, there are parts of Israel, that is the 1967 boundaries. Within the 67 boundaries, there are areas that we can sort of trade off to the Palestinians, and meanwhile we can draw the borders into Palestinian territory so that we can take areas that are heavily settled by Jews. By redrawing those boundaries, therefore, you correct to some degree for the fact that Arabs have been increasing as a share of Israel's population, and you're able to undo some of that demographic damage, so to speak, that's taken place. And so you can get an engineering through redrawing of boundaries, which is another important component. So just to conclude then, the argument here is that uneven demographic transitions between ethnic and religious groups within a country can lead to a change in the population mix within a country. Similarly, the differential growth rates between particularly religious fundamentalists and seculars within a country can change the mix between religion and secularism within a country. It can strengthen religious fundamentalism. However, it's not inevitable. Demographic shifts can produce violence, they can produce change, but a lot of this depends upon group dynamics. How tight or loose are the boundaries between the groups? In the United States, I think you could argue that the boundaries are somewhat fluid. There's intermarriage, there's redefinition of boundaries. Sub-Saharan Africa, Caribbean, also there is a degree to which people can say, marry into a Kikuyu family and become Kikuyu. That kind of assimilation takes place. In other situations, I talked about Northern Ireland, talked about India, the boundaries are extremely tight between groups, so there you would expect demographic change to translate into more trouble. And finally, demographic change can sometimes be engineered by political elites. So I'll just stop.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much, Mark. Two excellent presentations. We have a chance now for some questions, and then we'll have an opportunity to hear again from Jack and hear from Liz Leahy-Madsen. But why don't we throw the floor open again? We'll ask that you use the microphone. Sean, we have one down here in the front, if you can start us down.
Thank you both for very nice presentations. I want to address my question to Mark Haas. And I know it confounds your arithmetic, but why do you so discount the potential of immigration to change these demographic profiles?
Well, main reason is because to offset the scope of the aging problem, the level of immigration would have to be orders of magnitude higher than historical levels. So in order for Japan not to go from 20% of its population to a third of its population over 65, it would have to be much, much, much higher. And not only is that in ordinary times unlikely, but as we mentioned in the first part of Jack's discussion, at the same time that some of these aging societies probably need, just from an economic point of view, a higher level of immigration, some are actually putting up stricter immigration laws. We see that in Russia, and we've seen that in Japan. So it's just the political realities and the numbers work against it.
Okay. Other questions or comments? One in the back.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen. I'm fascinated by the comments of both of you. Something that still troubles me, well, a couple things. One is there wasn't much discussion. Numbers matter, and numbers are definitive. But something that troubles me is we sort of just assume, like many of our good economist theoretical friends, on the one hand, on the other hand, that governance itself is just a neutral item in all this, when I think governance is a huge factor in making mistakes, economically, socially, and otherwise, and that changes the curves. The second point is I'd like your comments on this teeter-totter that you seem to indirectly describe as, balancing or doesn't affect your projected outcome. Is the teeter-totter always assumed to be above, you say, mean sea level, which is adequate well-being, or perhaps in the case of the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, I thought that was a fascinating newspaper article this past few days, that they are all of a sudden becoming assertive. I'm wondering, is it because they're at a lower well-being level and have to seize the well-being assets or feel they do? Or is it something else you might suggest? Thank you.
Do you want to address part of that?
Yeah, sure. Those are great questions. I don't mean to leave governance out. Governance can be a great corrective or amplifier, depending on your perspective. I guess I was alluding that to a little bit when I was talking about the U.S. has a lot of native demographic advantages. But it does require political leadership to take advantage of them, to make sure that they're used, if you like, American power for the preservation of American power. But if you want to talk about governance, I actually don't see that happening right now. The longer, if you have a $32 trillion deficit over the next 75 years, the longer you take in addressing that deficit, the more painful the changes will be when they come. I forget whose law it is, but there's some law that things that can't be sustained won't be sustained. And you can't, when you're 100% of your discretionary spending is dedicated to two programs and nothing else, that obviously can't be sustained. So changes are on the way. It's just a question of how draconian they'll be, how painful they will be. So leadership is a big problem or a big issue. And from my perspective, many of America's intrinsic demographic issues aren't being taken advantage of to the greatest extent possible. I mentioned, for example, the lot of slack in the system in terms of when Americans expect to retire, much higher than European countries. Well, there's some leeway there in terms of raising retirement age. We see that a little bit today, but it could perhaps be amplified or accelerated. So you're 100% right. Leadership matters, and I think Jennifer Scuba's book, her chapter after mine in the volume, Jack could probably comment better than I do, tries to deal with some of the ways in which governments try to offset the demographic disadvantages, some of them caused by aging. My only point is that governments know this is happening, but no government yet among the great powers has taken action that offset the obligations due to seniors and has corrected that with anticipated revenues. There's still a huge gap in every one of the great powers. So there's room for leadership, but it hasn't been acted upon yet.
Yeah, just a good question on the ultra-Orthodox. One of the differences I see between the ultra-Orthodox and let's say the Islamists in North Africa is that with the ultra-Orthodox, they actually, they are educated, they have access to all of what modernity has to offer, and they're deliberately rejecting it. Whereas the Islamists in North Africa really come from a sort of quite poor rural background. So you might make the argument that with proper economic policies and governance, some of those grievances could be addressed in the case of the Islamists. But in the case of the ultra-Orthodox, really, they have a completely different worldview that is not amenable to better education, more money. In fact, quite the opposite. The way women select marriage partners in the ultra-Orthodox world is who is the best scholar, not who's got the career, because that's frowned upon. So if that's the kind of the way that the values, that the status system works, it's not going to be amenable to material policy interventions. I don't.
Yeah, gentleman in the back.
Good afternoon. This is for Mark. Could you, going back to guns versus canes, could you go just a little bit, Mark, into the likely tension that would inhere between the United States and its allies when the likelihood of the United States having to sustain the larger share of the burden-sharing role and how free riders might be alienated? That's one piece. Another question. Could you examine also the reliance on technology versus standing armies as demographic shifts occur within the United States and also among its allies? And a third note, and this is a very personal note, very, very good to see you. Thank you for today's remarks. It is because of stuff like this that I should have crashed your discussion section in Charlottesville when I wasn't suffering through my science class. So thanks again.
Well, thank you very much. Free riding is a problem even in the best of circumstances, right? But it's going to be amplified in coming days. The U.S. is still going to share a number of common interests with its European allies and Japan, but they are going to be, the demographics are going to shift the resources away from it. So we saw this in the conflict in Libya, right? We saw you had the Secretary of Defense saying that this is the key test for NATO. NATO's not meeting its fair share. The U.S. is doing too much. So I don't know what to say other than free riding is going to escalate, and tensions with the U.S. between its allies are going to escalate as well. And the only option, I guess, it's at some point, right, if you combine the less burden-sharing point that I made in combination with the crowding out for the U.S., the U.S. is going to retreat from the world, I believe, at least clearly from where it is today, and the Europeans are going to be left to be, to a certain extent, sink or swim. And that's just how it is. So that's one way to deal with the free riding problem is if you offshore balance, if you retreat and say it's your politics is local, you deal with problems, then they're going to be forced. But I'm not so sure that they're going to have the capabilities to do it. So it is problematic. Your second point, technology. Reliance, can you elaborate on that? Just the shift from...
Much like we see now with, drones, probably independently operated vehicles like drones instead of a reliance on a standing army, per se. So what that might, or how demographic shifts might bode for the use of technology, not really strict technology, but less man-guided or independent technology than a standing army or forces deployed, that sort of thing.
No, I'm with you. Well, it's this is something that Jack touched a little bit on the opening. There is going to be a try to shift away from boots on the ground towards high tech. My point on that would be that because within defense budgets, there's going to be a shift or there's going to be a disposition to increase personnel costs. It's going to be harder for other countries to make that shift to the extent that the U.S. is. So the amount that the U.S. is going to be able to spend on research and development in the military is going to maintain its superiority, I think. Again, the U.S. spends $80 billion on research and development within its defense budget. Other countries don't come close to that, and it's going to be even harder for them to do that in coming years. So But let's talk afterwards. It's good to see you again.
To Eric on the ultra-Orthodox and material incentives. The work I'm sure you know of Eli Berman shows starts off with the electoral system, low threshold in PR. Low threshold in PR means ultra-Orthodox parties get seats. Getting seats, they make one claim to become coalition partners, and that is relatively free and unencumbered Talmudic education for the rest of their lives. So, in a sense, the electoral system is giving material security to the most ultra-Orthodox families as a payoff for their votes on whatever major party they're coalesced with. So, in a sense, marrying someone who's a Talmudic scholar gives you a lifetime of material advantage without having your husband having to go to work. I don't want to claim they're completely incentivized by these material advantages, but I think it's wrong to say that that there's no evidence of material incentives in this equation.
Yeah, very good question, David. You're right. I mean, that is Berman's argument. But I think if you look, what's interesting is if you go outside of Israel and you look at the diaspora, which doesn't benefit from that state largesse in the same way. Now, of course, there's a high welfare dependency amongst the ultra-Orthodox community in Britain, but a much higher proportion do work. I think if you look at the fertility rates of the ultra-Orthodox in the U.S. and Britain, they are just as impressive. Perhaps they're not at 7.5, but they're at sort of in the 6 region. So they're still extremely high. So I guess I'm a bit I remain to be convinced that tweaking with the benefit system, even if that were possible, because we know that the Shas and the UTJ have got a lot of clout over, or they're kingmakers or can be kingmakers in Israeli politics, so they have the clout perhaps to keep those benefits for a while. But I guess I'm not persuaded that that those material benefits are what's driving the high fertility. I think they might account for a small part of the variation, but I'm not. I guess my view is that there's a different worldview operating there, where the ultra-Orthodox are keeping out sort of the value systems of the rest of Israeli society. So I guess I see that as a more important driver. But that's not to deny the role of material incentives. I would think that the role of material incentives would be much stronger, though, in the case of religious fundamentalism in the Middle East in Muslim groups, where I think there is a lot of evidence that there's a strong grievance component that can be linked to the absence of provision of social welfare, for example, which is where the Muslim Brotherhood was able to step in. So I do think that's different. But for the ultra-Orthodox, I think it is a new paradigm, really. But anyway, that's my...
Oh, there's one back there. Sorry, it's just dark. I can't see so well.
Thank you. Could you both address sustainability, environmental sustainability, and climate change, which have implications for both of your subject matter, it seems? I mean, there's been a lot written about how climate change is going to impact security, and also how it might be playing into many of the conflicts in the world, religious and ethnic conflicts that are really cloaking shortages of resources. And we're already seeing, there's a lot of research that shows that many of the world's bread baskets are going to be under increasing stress, including in this country, and in countries that are so-called failed states today. There's indications that sustainability issues are cloaking other, or at least playing into a lot of these other factors.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you asked the question about resources, and David Layton over there, who's a real expert on, he's written some very interesting, a paper on what he calls Sons of the Soil, which is where you have conflicts over land resources, pitting sort of loosely, I guess I would call indigenous or native ethnic groups from one part of the country against settlers who come in from another part of the country. And this is something that's detailed in some of the chapters in the book, particularly in Uganda and Kenya, where you have settlers from more advanced areas on the coast moving inland. And that can lead to sort of low-level conflicts. Now, I think in order for those to become high-level civil wars, that does require political mobilization at the center, so it does require an added variable. So you can have the sort of low-level conflicts caused by resources. I think, as Jack mentioned, for those to actually burst into significant higher-level civil wars, I think takes a lot more. So I guess the evidence isn't yet there that that environmental change leads to large-scale conflict. But I think there is some evidence that it can lead to sort of low-level, localized conflict. But maybe you could talk a bit more about that. Yeah.
I'll just say a word about that. There's been a lot of apprehension over the years about the impending role of climate change provoking conflict. There was a study done some almost 20 years ago that targeted Bangladesh in particular as being extremely vulnerable because of its low-lying land, exposure of a large portion of the population to natural disasters and storms coming up from the Bay of Bengal. And there was, in fact, a major storm that flooded much of the country some 8 to 10 years ago. But the expected disaster in terms of poverty and conflict did not arise because the government had grown stronger in the intervening years and had strengthened the system of dikes and humanitarian provision. So despite the severe floods, people didn't starve, people weren't driven to fight for food. They stayed on high ground, they were supplied, and they returned to rebuild. Another study that was done recently, appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, claimed to find a correlation between temperature increase and conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. But it studied a particular period in the 1990s that saw both a high incidence of conflict and a persistent temperature rise. If you go to the following decade, from 2000 to 2010, you have the same persistent temperature rise, but without the conflict incidents. So I'll talk about this a little bit later after the next break, but I think the bottom line is climate change is a risk factor, but it's one of many risk factors, including deliberate ethnic efforts to consolidate one ethnic group's position at the expense of others, or conflict over resources. And all of these risks are essentially mediated by the quality of governance, inclusion, law enforcement, as to whether they escalate into violent conflicts or whether they're contained.
I'll just say we're posting a summary of an active session where we had 4 speakers address this issue on December 19th here at the center, including Solomon Siang, who was the lead author on the article, Mark Levy from Columbia, Josh Busby from UT Austin and their CCAF's work, and Joe Hewitt from AID. And so it was a rich session that has both the transcript and the video. So for folks who are interested in that climate conflict link, such as it is or isn't, that was a lively discussion. Urge you to do that. We had another hand, yes?
Another question, James Sang. Another question on background assumptions. Most of us agree that having fewer people between 15 to 64 is not a good idea. But there's a fairly popular book right now, Race Against the Machine, which is part of the school that says that productivity has gone up so fast that the number of workers we need is going down. Would assumptions like that, would a scenario like that, in fact, greatly change your conclusions? I mean, technology always produces improvements in productivity, and if you make the improvements in productivity large enough, would you, in fact, not be better off by having fewer workers of a certain age?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I can answer it adequately. Be better off. Obviously, if your productivity levels are higher, you could offset the negative implications, but you're saying it'd actually be better off. If productivity gains are high enough, it would actually be good to have fewer 15 to 64-year-olds. Is it? I'll have to think about that. Actually, I haven't seen a study where I've seen, obviously, where I've talked to some Japanese scholars saying, well, you know, if we offset with productivity, we'll be okay, but I haven't seen the argument made where it will actually be advantageous to be aging to the extent that people are dropping 20, 30% in working age populations. If you, I don't know. Maybe Jack, do you know anything about?
Yeah,
use Lifeline.
it's certainly the case that big improvements in productivity will help rich nations pay for the health care and pension costs of the older generation. So if you have fewer younger workers, but they're far more productive, that would be a good thing. It's not so much, I don't think, an issue of adjusting to unemployment. It's dealing with this overhang of elderly who will not be working as much. But the question is where those productivity gains are going to come from. We have had huge productivity gains in manufacturing and continue to do so, but manufacturing is increasingly only a small portion of the labor force in the rich countries. The unemployment problem we're getting is because jobs in manufacturing are to some degree static. Most of the gains are from increasing productivity. People are going into the retail sector, and retail sector jobs often are temporary, lower paid. The other fact is that much of the increase in employment in the service sector is in areas that require substantial training. So if you're going into medical care or education or government service, you increasingly require a 4-year degree, and a lot of the people who are suffering from structural employment came out of the manufacturing workforce and don't have that. So I think what we have at the moment is this substantial temporary mismatch of going through technological change, particularly manufacturing, also to some degree communication. We have to shift people into services. Services can be either higher productivity or lower productivity, and we're not in a situation where workers are being able to move from high productivity manufacturing to the high productivity services. That's why we suffer oddly from this shortage of workers for many high skill occupations that are looking for work, whether it's engineers, nurses, and so on, but we also have large numbers of unemployed. So I think that's not just an issue of, yes, things will get better if productivity increases. It's this complexity of understanding you've got different workers who are in different stages of the life course, who have different backgrounds in work history and training, and the job configuration in rich societies is changing rapidly, creating a lack of fit. I mean, one of the things that I say in the first chapter of the book is part of the power of understanding demography is trying to understand how societies continue to reproduce themselves over time. It's not just enough to have more or less people born. You have to have people who, as they grow up, are effectively socialized into productive roles in society. And it's making that fit work that is a struggle today in both the rich countries and the poor countries, and creating, what Eric said, is this kind of unusual period of demographic, economic, and social turmoil.
Well, thank you again for excellent questions and 2 excellent presentations. I suggest now what we do is grab some coffee, have another short break, and then come back and we'll have our final panel and with Liz Leahy-Madsen and Jack Goldstone to wrap up. So join me in thanking Mark and Eric.